The historian behind the hit Broadway musical Hamilton is award-winning author Ron Chernow. His biography of founding father Alexander Hamilton has sold more than 1 million copies across all formats. Now Chernow is back with his 7th book. It is called Grant. It chronicles the life of Civil War General and 18th U.S. President Ulysses S. Grant. Ron Chernow joins us now. We're pleased to have him back at the table. Welcome.
I am pleased to be here, Charlie. Thank you.
So for a famous biographer like you, the first question might be, why Grant?
Well, you know, I always had this fantasy of writing a big, sweeping saga about the Civil War and Reconstruction, and Grant is the person who is at the center of that. It's really 2 acts of the same drama, and just if you look through the prism of Ulysses S. Grant's life, everything significant that happens between 1861 and 1877, he is right smack at the center of it.
What made him the great general he was?
Well, I think, you know...
And he doesn't get credit for that, as you point out.
You know, it's very interesting because Robert E. Lee is always glorified as the great general, but Grant captured 3 Confederate armies at Fort Donelson in 1862, at Vicksburg in 1863, most famously Appomattox in 1865, and yet Lee is the one who's romanticized as the great general. Robert E. Lee never captured a Union army. Grant was decisive, he was determined, he was aggressive. And unlike Lee, who had plans for winning individual battles, Ulysses S. Grant had a strategy for winning the entire war. And he did that, Charlie, he took all the Union armies which had been operating independently, and he coordinated that so that they were functioning as a single fighting unit, and that was the winning strategy.
Functioning well, he seemed to drink quite a bit, as you point out in the book. He was described as a drunkard and had to promise people, I promise not to drink before we go to battle.
Well, what I've tried to do, Gayle, you know, in this book is to change the terms of the controversy. It was Grant a drunkard to was Grant an alcoholic, and he was an alcoholic.
What's the difference between a drunkard and an alcoholic?
Well, I feel with, you know, drunkard that there's, it's a Victorian term. It implies that drinking is a moral failing. Nowadays, we know that alcoholism is a chronic disease, and Grant had it. Once he took 1 drink, he could not stop drinking. It triggered off an extreme personality change. He became a rather jovial and silly personality. And what I discovered was that there was a definite pattern to his drinking, because a lot of people in good faith said, I never saw Grant drink. But what he would do, he would not touch a drop of alcohol for 2 or 3 month periods. After a major battle, he would then go up to a small town on a side trip, have a 2 or 3 day bender that his officers and his men never saw. And then he would come back, as William Tecumseh Sherman said, fresh as a rose. Mm-hmm. When I would tell this story to my friends in AA, they all said the same thing. Ulysses S. Grant was a high-functioning alcoholic.
And as you mentioned, it ran on his family as well. He served in the Mexican War, and you talk about in the book how, as far as Grant was concerned, the Civil War was in large part a consequence of the Mexican War. Can you explain that a bit more?
Right, because, you know, the abolitionists felt that by adding Texas and other territories in the South and Southwest of the Union, that these would potentially become slave states and would expand the power of the slave empire. Grant was, although he fought with distinction in the Mexican War, he said that it was the most unjust war, in his view, ever waged by a stronger nation against a weaker nation. And indeed, the acquisition of territory after the victorious war against Mexico did ignite the debate about abolition.
I'm interested in how he thought about Lee. What was his, did he respect Lee? Because there's a famous story that, that when he accepted the surrender, as Lee was coming back, you know, the Union soldiers made a certain...
Grant respected Lee, but he also thought that Lee was highly overrated. He said Robert E. Lee was a man who needed sunshine. He felt that Lee was actually politically operating in a much easier environment in the South, where he was constantly glorified, where Grant in the North, where there was a lot of anti-war sentiment, the so-called Copperhead Democrats, Grant felt that he was constantly being denigrated from his own side, so that Lee had a lot of advantages. Grant had more advantages in terms of manpower, but Lee was fighting on home territory. Lee was fighting a defensive war, which is much easier. Lee had all of these spies who could track the Union movements, and Grant had to protect these very long supply lines going down from the north into the south.
When people talk about great memoirs, they talk about Charles de Gaulle, and they talk about Ulysses S. Grant. And then they suggest that his friend, or was he his friend, Mark Twain, may have had some impact, some role.
And it was a memoir he didn't want to write. I thought that was
He didn't want to write it. A year before he died, he was financially wiped out by the Bernie Madoff of his day. At the same time, he was diagnosed with cancer of the throat and tongue, an excruciating way to die, and in excruciating pain. He wrote this memoir during the last year of his life. Charlie, so many people asked me, did Twain write the memoir? I said, I went down to the Library of Congress, and I said, show me the original manuscript. I went through every page of the original manuscript just to verify that the manuscript was in Ulysses S. Grant's handwriting. And Twain said of Grant's memoirs, the style is flawless. No man can improve upon it. And I don't think that...
so how come he was such a good writer?
Yeah, there was a Twain connection, though, to the memoir.
Well, he was such a good writer because Grant had always prided himself on his writing. He wrote all his own wartime orders. Charlie, he wrote all of his own speeches as president, so in a way, and he was also considered a great raconteur, and people had heard him tell these stories, and so in a way, it's not so surprising. He produced what is now thought to be the greatest, military memoir in American letters.
But the Twain connection, though, is because, the Twain published the book.
Twain published the book.
Charlie's saying.
Yeah, absolutely.
And he wrote 10,000 words
So
a
is
day.
this a musical or not?
Yes.
No.
We asked Lynn when he was here.
What did Lynn say?
What do you say?
Well, I think it's safe to say that Grant's life does not move to a hip-hop beat,
we'll
but I'm
see.
hoping it'll be a feature.
You never
film.
know.
I wouldn't bet
film.
against Lynn.
Film.
Big book, Ron Chernow. Grant goes on sale tomorrow wherever you like to buy your books, and you can hear more of the CBS This Morning on our podcast, on iTunes and Apple Podcast app.